Hello, and thanks for stopping by. London is blessed with many iconic streets, all of which are bristling with history, and in lots of cases, plenty of intriguing secrets too. A perfect example is Baker Street, which runs for just over half a mile through Marylebone, linking Regent's Park to Portsmouth Square. When you hear the words Baker Street, I bet the first connection your mind springs to is Sherlock Holmes, and he'd be right to, of course. We'll be seeing more of him shortly. Holmes and Watson aside though, there's a lot more to discover on Baker Street, including tales of real-life wartime agents, an audacious bank heist, and a 1920s women's detective school. There's a connection with the Beatles too, and in this video I'm going to be showing you all of these sites, plus much more. So let's get started. We'll begin our tour at the northern tip of Baker Street, which is marked by Clarence Gate, one of the main access points into Regent's Park. This neat little structure is Clarence Gate Lodge, which was built in 1823 as a residence for the gatekeeper. I doubt any job in London nowadays would offer such a cushy perk. Baker Street itself can trace its origins back to 1755, when work on laying it out began. Now, this will probably come as a disappointment to some, but Baker Street's name has nothing to do with bread, pies or cakes. The name is in fact a reference to a fellow named Mr. Baker, although there's some dispute as to exactly which Mr. Baker that was. There are two contenders for the accolade, both of whom had dealings with the Portsmouth estate, the owners of the land upon which Baker Street is located. The first, and it would seem most popular candidate, is William Baker, the speculative builder who leased the land from the Portmans in order to begin work on his Grand Road and accompanying houses. Others though think the name refers to Sir Edward Baker, who was a friend of the Portman family and who aided them in developing their estate. So, which Baker do you think it was? Please let me know in the comments. Conjured up in the mind of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was only in his 20s at the time, Sherlock Holmes first appeared in the 1887 story A Study in Scarlet. In that tale, Baker Street is mentioned in the opening chapter, in which Sherlock, upon meeting Watson for the first time, suggests a flat share. "I have my eye on a suite in Baker Street," he says, "which would suit us down to the ground. You don't mind the smell of strong tobacco, I hope?" The flat, 221B, is then described in the second chapter, in which Dr. Watson tells us it consisted of a couple of comfortable bedrooms and a single large airy sitting room, cheerfully furnished and illuminated by two broad windows. Sadly, number 221B has never officially existed on Baker Street. Had it have done so though, the numbering suggests it would have stood approximately here, on the site now occupied by Abbey House, the former headquarters of the Abbey National Building Society. This is how the site looked in 1906, a scene it would have been familiar to Holmes and Watson, had they been real of course. When the Festival of Britain was held in 1951, the Abbey National decided to get involved by hosting an exhibition about Sherlock Holmes at their HQ, which included a mock-up of 221B Baker Street.
This is the study in which the private consulting detective received his clients, the room in which so many a mystery began. It has been recreated with such attention to detail that even Holmes himself could not have bettered the great detective work involved in translating legend into reality.
The artefacts from this display were later used to kit out the Northumberland Arms pub on Northumberland Street near Trafalgar Square, which is being turned into a themed pub called the Sherlock Holmes. You can still see some of the items from the Baker Street display in there today. The Sherlock Holmes Museum, meanwhile, which opened in 1990 and is just a few doors up from Abbey House, does a similar job to the 1951 exhibition. If you're a fan of the BBC series Sherlock, which stars Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, and which puts a modern spin on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, then you may be wondering where the flat used for that show was filmed. Well, although it wasn't shot on the Baker Street, the level of traffic here is too impractical. The location used isn't too far away. You'll find it above Speedy Sandwich Bar on North Gower Street, which is just around the corner from Euston Square Station. After looking at Sherlock Holmes, I think now would be the perfect time for a bit of true crime, and Baker Street has the perfect tale, as in the early 1970s, this bank, at number 185, found itself at the centre of one of Britain's most audacious heists. In those days, these two shops next door to the bank, Taco Bell and an estate agent called Fraser & Co, were occupied by different businesses. The Taco Bell was still a restaurant, although it belonged to a different chain called Chicken Inn, whilst the estate agent's was a fancy leather bag shop called S.O.E H.Q. In the late August of 1971, a criminal gang began renting S.O.E H.Q, and after whitewashing the windows for privacy, they began digging through the floor, forging a secret and rather claustrophobic tunnel that burrowed beneath the Chicken Inn restaurant. On the night of Saturday the 11th of September, they finally broke through into the vault of Lloyd's, using a thermal lance to blast through the thick concrete floor, which, as you can probably imagine, would have been pretty dangerous in such a cramped environment. As they worked, the crooks used walkie-talkies to communicate with a lookout who was stationed on the roof of a nearby building, and these conversations happened to be intercepted and recorded by a ham radio enthusiast named Robert Rowlands, who lived just under a mile away on Wimpole Street. Here's an excerpt of what he heard.
How's everything? Okay? Everything's fine. No intruders whatsoever. Over. Alright, now you've done a good job, Bob. Listen, we're not going to work too late. We're going to finish the rest of the easy ones off. We're going to have a go at some of the other ones. We're going to clean up in here, and we should be coming out early this afternoon.
Robert alerted police, but being both late and the weekend, all banks were shut, which made a search nigh on impossible, especially when Scotland Yard insisted that some 750 branches within an 8-mile radius had to be checked out, despite Robert insisting, correctly, that the signal was very close to Wimpole Street. Meanwhile, the gang were now rifling through the contents of almost 250 safety deposit boxes, from which it's estimated they stole some £3 million worth of valuables, roughly £31 million in today's money. Legend has it that before scarpering, they even left a cheeky bit of graffiti on the vault's wall, which read, "Let's see how Sherlock Holmes solves this one." The man who owned the S.O.E H.Q and who'd rented it out to the gang was one Benjamin Wolfe, who himself was a rather dodgy bloke, and through him police managed to apprehend several of the robbers, namely Anthony Gavin, Thomas Stevens and Reg Tucker, all of who were eventually found guilty and sentenced to 12 years, whilst Benjamin Wolfe received 8. Despite this, only a small percentage of the loot was ever recovered, and there were certainly more people, possibly including a woman, who were never caught. Furthermore, details on the crime and its reporting have been somewhat murky over the years. A large file, for example, containing 800 pages on the incident, is currently under lock and key at the National Archives, and has been ordered to remain sealed until January 2071. So, if you happen to be watching this in the distant future, I hope the juicy details were worth the wait. Because of this secrecy, it's been speculated that, during the course of the robbery, the gang may have discovered material of a highly sensitive nature, which would have compromised the reputation of certain establishment figures. Located opposite the scene of the 1971 robbery, Chiltern Court is a large and very grand building that sits above Baker Street Tube Station. Originally, it was intended to be a hotel, and construction began in 1912, but the project ground to a halt following the outbreak of the First World War, and work didn't recommence until 1927. The huge block was finally completed in 1929. In the wake of the Great War, the hotel idea was ditched, and the rooms were instead sold as apartments. A number of notable people have lived there over the years, the most famous being the pioneering science fiction author H.G. Wells, who was a resident between 1930 and 1936. During this period, Wells's most notable novel was The Shape of Things to Come, which was adapted for film in 1936. Amongst other things, this novel predicted the outbreak of the Second World War, the development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and a future global pandemic. Sound familiar?
The streets will be dangerous. Do not assemble in crowds. Keep indoors. Go home. Those who are far from home can take refuge in the underground railways. Go home. Go home. Go home.
Although the hotel never came into being, a restaurant did open within the building, called, rather unimaginatively, the Chiltern Court Restaurant, a vintage advertisement for which can be seen on Baker Street Station's Platform 1. We'll be seeing more of the station later, by the way. The restaurant is now the Metropolitan Bar, a branch of the Wetherspoons pub chain, which has maintained many of the original features. Our next point of interest is a blue plaque, which can be found outside Chiltern Court. It reads, "In this building, S.O.E.'s Norwegian section planned the Telemark raid to disrupt the development of Nazi atomic weapons." So, what's the story here? Well, the S.O.E. stands for the Special Operations Executive, a top secret organisation which was formed in World War II. We'll be seeing more of them later in the video. And Telemark is a mountainous region in Norway, which, in the first half of the 20th century, was home to the world's largest hydroelectric plant. By the early 1940s, this plant was producing substantial quantities of heavy water, which is a vital component used in nuclear energy research. As Norway was under Nazi occupation, this posed a grave threat, as it was believed Hitler was intent on developing atomic weapons. The Allies of course simply could not allow this to happen, and so a daring series of operations, all of which were planned by the S.O.E. in this Baker Street location, were put into motion, using sketches and photographs that had been smuggled to London by Norwegian agents who worked at the plant. The first attempt at sabotage, which took place in November 1942, ended in disaster when the glider carrying the team to the site crashed. Those who weren't killed in the accident were rounded up by the Gestapo and interrogated under torture before being executed. Success was achieved in the early hours of the 28th of February 1943 with Operation Gunnerside, when a team of 12 commandos managed to infiltrate the plant via a cable tunnel after scaling the icy ravine upon which it sat. A perilous task, considering the Nazis had beefed up security with extra guards, floodlights and minefields. Once inside, explosive charges were set and detonated, which destroyed the electrolysis chambers used for making the heavy water. And despite some 3,000 German troops being sent to the area to hunt down the team, all 12 men managed to evade capture. This courageous operation was later dramatised in the 1965 film The Heroes of Telemark, and the plaque outside Chiltern Court was unveiled in 2016. Having first opened back in January 1863 as part of the Metropolitan Railway, which linked Paddington to Farringdon, Baker Street is one of the oldest underground stations in the world. It's a sprawling, beautiful place with bags of character, and it also happens to be the tube station with the most platforms, that number being 10.
Would Inspector Sands please go to the operation room immediately?
Personally, I'm especially fond of these vintage destination boards. And up in the ticket hall, you can also see these ghost signs for an old branch of W.H. Smith and the station's former tea room, which in 1952 inspired Sir John Betjeman to write his melancholy poem Baker Street Station Buffet. If you don't know it, you can find it inscribed in the description below. It really is worth a read. Down on Baker Street Station's deeper sections, the tiles famously display silhouetted motifs of Sherlock Holmes. Whilst up above, outside the entrance, you'll find a statue of the famous sleuth, which was sculpted by John Doubleday and unveiled in 1999. These platforms are part of the original part of Baker Street Station, which first saw steam locomotives back in 1863. And thanks to a restoration project carried out in 1983, they now look pretty much the same as they would have done back in the 19th century. Alongside the original platforms, you can also see this World War I memorial, which commemorates the many Metropolitan Railway workers who were killed in that hideous conflict, along with an old collection box from the same era, which was crafted from a large explosive shell. The Metropolitan Railway also had their headquarters at Baker Street, which were incorporated into the Chiltern Court block in the 1920s. If you head around the corner to Allsop Place, you'll see some rather quirky railway-themed architecture emblazoned upon their old offices, namely these ornate wheels and buffers. Baker Street is also notable in that it was the only tube station to have its own cinema. This was a news theatre, similar to the ones at the main line stations in Victoria and Waterloo, which I made a video about some time ago. I'll link that above and below in case you haven't seen it. The Baker Street News Theatre opened on the 7th of December 1938 and continued to screen daily looping newsreels until 1960. It then became a regular cinema, which closed for good in 1999. What a shame. London is well known for having a Piccadilly Circus, an Oxford Circus, and a Cambridge Circus too. It's nearly also had a Marylebone Circus, which is penciled in for this spot where Baker Street crosses Marylebone Road. The scheme, which no doubt would have involved a circular junction being placed here, was proposed at the start of the 20th century, although clearly it never came to fruition. Having said that, some people apparently do refer to this junction as Marylebone Circus, although to be honest, it's not a term I've ever used. How about you? Were you aware of the Marylebone Circus name? If so, please do let me know in the comments. We could cross the road out to the lights, but there is another way to negotiate this busy junction, which is a lot more interesting. Here, let me show you. It's called the Wonderpass. As we head down for a look, I'd really appreciate it if you're enjoying this video and haven't done so already, if you could please consider subscribing to my channel, as this, along with ringing the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus of course it'd be great to have you along. Anyway, the Wonderpass opened in 2016. It looks like something out of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, doesn't it? In days gone by, this was a typical pedestrian subway, dim, damp, grotty, and somewhat menacing. Now though, as you can see, it's a great place to explore, a mini museum containing dioramas related to the history of the local area. Here's a model of Baker Street Station in the 1860s. This represents the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, which opened in 1932. This rather creepy one is a mock-up of Marie Tussauds wax workshop. And this collage represents the Wallace Collection, which is on nearby Manchester Square. Whilst we're on the subject of Baker Street's more quirky side, I really should mention here that Danger Mouse, who when I was growing up was one of my favourite cartoon characters, lived in a high-tech post box on Baker Street, which someone has marked with what must be London's smallest blue plaque. You can find it back up the road, on the junction with Malcolm Street. We're now on the southern stretch of Baker Street, and this narrow doorway marks the former entrance to what I believe is one of the area's most fascinating historical gems, Charles Kersey's Detective School. Established in the 1920s, Kersey School was unique in that it only trained women. Apparently it was the only such place in the UK to do so. Here, budding candidates were taught how to apprehend criminals, along with self-defense techniques, and, most intriguingly, how to disguise themselves as very convincing looking men. This splendid newsreel from 1927 shows the school and its pupils in action. The women who signed up with Charles Kersey had a variety of reasons for wishing to do so. Some ran their own shop, meaning such skills would be useful in dealing with any potential troublemakers. Others hoped to become store detectives, a role that was in high demand in the years following World War I, as shoplifting was on the rise. Other undercover roles involved shadowing men who were up to no good, such as being suspected of having an affair, and this is where the need for disguise came in, as any woman tailing a suspect in places such as pubs or railway compartments would have found it much easier, in the very male-dominated 1920s and 30s at least, to do so in the guise of a chap. As we head for our next destination on Baker Street, there are a few more points of interest to note along the way. First is this building, which, as the blue plaque points out, was once lived in by William Pitt the Younger, Britain's youngest Prime Minister, who took office in 1738 at the tender age of 24. And this is the Sherlock Holmes Hotel, which can be spotted in the music video for Jerry Rafferty's famous 1978 hit, Baker Street. Sticking with pop music, Dusty Springfield lived on Baker Street for a time in the 1960s. Just here it's number 113. And a little further down the road, on the junction of Paddington Street, there once stood our next site, the short-lived Apple Boutique. The Apple Boutique, which sold an array of fashionable clothes and accessories, was a business venture set up by the Beatles, and the store opened on the 7th of December 1967, when the group were at the height of their musical powers. Initially, the shop's exterior was decorated with a psychedelic mural, very fitting for the era, which was designed by a Dutch art collective known as The Fool. This groovy aesthetic didn't go down too well though with the rather more traditional neighbouring shop owners, and as the Fab Four hadn't sought permission for the piece from the Portman estate, the artwork had to be painted over in a more minimalist design. They needn't have bothered though, as the venture only lasted a mere 8 months. This was largely due to shoplifting, which was rife both amongst customers and staff, yet the shop's hippie ethos forbade any contact with the law. Consequently, the Apple Boutique hemorrhaged cash, with its final loss standing at around £200,000, which is about 3.5 million today. And I thought I was bad with money. The shop closed its doors for good on the 31st of July 1968, and the original building was demolished in the mid-1970s. The one you see today is a reconstruction, albeit somewhat taller. The site is also marked with a plaque commemorating both John Lennon and George Harrison, the two Beatles who, of course, are sadly no longer with us. On a more cheery note, there's now a Beatles souvenir shop at the northern end of Baker Street, and the interior of the former Apple Boutique can be seen in this clip from the 1968 film Hot Millions, which starred a young Dame Maggie Smith.
Oh, you are good, Willard.
How much?
£20.
£20.
20? Don't know, I'll make a change meeting a man with a bit of clothes.
We encountered the Special Operations Executive, the S.O.E, earlier in this video when we looked at the Heroes of Telemark plaque at Chiltern Court. The S.O.E in fact requisitioned numerous properties along Baker Street, and this building, number 64, which is now marked with a green plaque, served as their discreet headquarters. The S.O.E had 3 nicknames, all of which hinted as to what their role was, these being Churchill's Secret Army, the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, and the Baker Street Irregulars, which of course is a reference to the cheeky gang of streetwise urchins who aided Sherlock Holmes with certain cases. In short, the S.O.E were tasked with conducting reconnaissance, espionage and sabotage within Nazi-occupied Europe, key to which was liaising with groups such as the French Resistance. After a brief stint in Whitehall, the S.O.E set up shop on Baker Street in the autumn of 1941, and although the various offices were dotted along the famous road, no hint was given as to their true existence. You certainly wouldn't have found them in the telephone directory. In all, around 13,000 people worked for the S.O.E, some 3,200 of whom were women, including Violet Szabo, Virginia Hall, and Noor Inayat Khan. The bravery of such agents was beyond compare, and to be honest, it's simply impossible for me to do their legacy justice in a video of this nature. Our final site for today is number 55 Baker Street, which as you can see is now a modern office block. In centuries past though, this was the site of a large and famous complex of buildings which were collectively known as the Baker Street Bazaar. The bazaar was originally intended to be a market square, and work on laying it out commenced in the 1770s. This initial vision was never completed though, and the land ended up being occupied by barracks, which were used by the 2nd Troop of Horse Guards, who were heavily involved in the Napoleonic Wars. In 1822, the barracks moved to Albany Street near Regent's Park, where they remain today, and the infrastructure left behind at Baker Street, which comprised of between 400 to 500 horse stalls, along with a riding and exercise ground, became the Horse Bazaar, which, as the name suggests, was a place where you could come and purchase a horse. In a way, I guess that's made it to the early 19th century equivalent of a large second-hand car dealership. But indeed, as this advert from 1909 shows, there was also a time when you could purchase motor vehicles here. By 1826, the Horse Bazaar had morphed into the New Bazaar, which was fast becoming a collection of fancy shops where you could buy anything from watches and jewellery to toys and furniture. Part of this complex was a building known as the Great Room, and it was here, in 1835, after a stint on Gray's Inn Road, that Madame Marie Tussaud set up a celebrated waxwork exhibition. From the offset, Madame Tussauds included the gruesome and highly popular Chamber of Horrors, which depicted various historical nastiness. This image, for example, dating from 1893, shows a tableau representing the execution of Mary Queen of Scots. The waxworks remained on Baker Street for almost 50 years, before Marie's grandsons moved the exhibition to a larger site on Marylebone Road, next door to Baker Street Station, where it remains popular today, although the Chamber of Horrors closed for good in 2016 after bowing to modern sensibilities. The Baker Street Bazaar, meanwhile, eventually developed into a more conventional department store called Drews's, but sadly the site was badly damaged during the Blitz, and the surviving buildings were torn down in the late 1950s. From here, Baker Street continues to run south in a straight line, the route going along Portman Square and Orchard Street, before crossing Oxford Street and continuing on towards Grosvenor Square. These addresses all have their own stories too, of course, but for now, we'll have to save those for another day. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this tour of Baker Street. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this famous road. What's your favourite aspect of it? And are there any other items of historic interest along it that you can think of? Please do let me know in the comments. And if there are any other famous roads you'd like to see covered in a similar video, please do feel free to suggest them. If you're a new subscriber to the channel, I'd like to take this opportunity to offer you a very warm welcome. Thank you too to all of you who left such kind comments recently. I truly appreciate them. If you're not yet a subscriber, it'd be wonderful if you could please consider clicking the bell to sign up. And if you do, don't forget to click the bell icon too, as this will send you a notification whenever I publish a new video. If you're in a generous mood, you can support my Rob's London channel in two ways. First is via my Ko-fi account, where you can leave a tip. Any such support is of course greatly appreciated. And secondly, I have an online store, Rob's Online Designs, where you can purchase a variety of hand-drawn mugs, featuring illustrations of taxis, tube trains, buses and so on. I'll leave links to both in the description. Oh, and likes and shares are also very helpful too, as they really do help the channel to grow. Anyway, for now, thanks again friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.